I'm going to read you a list. These are documented reasons why people were committed to insane asylums in the Victorian era. Every single one of these appears in official asylum admission records. Ready? Novel reading. Laziness. Disappointed love. Bad company. Religious enthusiasm. Excessive study. Jealousy. Egotism. Salvation Army. Tobacco use. Menstrual problems. Masturbation. Grief. Asthma. Snuff eating. Political excitement. And my personal favorite, imaginary female trouble. These aren't jokes. These aren't exaggerations. These are the actual, documented reasons that real human beings were locked away in Victorian asylums, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. A woman could be committed for reading too many novels. A man could be committed for being too passionate about politics. A teenager could be committed for masturbation and kept there for 30 years. And once you were inside, getting out was almost impossible. This is the story of the Victorian asylum system. Where being different meant being dangerous. Where disagreeing with your husband meant you were insane. And where the definition of madness was whatever the men in charge decided it was. Before we go inside the asylums, you need to understand how shockingly easy it was to put someone there. In Britain, the Lunacy Act of 1845 was supposed to protect people. It established a system of inspectors. It required proper certification. It was meant to prevent wrongful confinement. But here's what actually happened. To commit someone to an asylum, you needed 2 signatures from doctors, any doctors, and the agreement of a family member. That's it. No court hearing. No chance for the person to defend themselves. No independent evaluation. If your husband wanted you gone, he found 2 doctors who would sign. If your father wanted to hide your illegitimate pregnancy, he found 2 doctors who would sign. If your family was embarrassed by your eccentric behavior, they found 2 doctors who would sign. And what counted as evidence of insanity? Here's what the medical establishment believed. Women who studied too much were damaging their reproductive organs, which would cause madness. Women who had strong opinions were exhibiting moral insanity. Women who wanted divorces were clearly deranged. Women who enjoyed sex were suffering from uterine disorders. A doctor visiting a girls' school in 1858 warned, "You seem to be training your girls for the lunatic asylum." Their crime. Education. The message was clear: if you were a woman who thought for herself, who spoke her mind, who refused to submit, you were sick. And being sick meant being locked away until you learned to behave. By the mid-19th century, asylums were overflowing. And surveys revealed something disturbing: there were significantly more women than men inside. Not because women were more prone to mental illness, but because mental illness was defined by men, for the benefit of men. Reading novels. Insane. Refusing to obey your husband. Insane. Asking for a divorce. Insane. Going through menopause. Change of life, madness, definitely insane. Having an opinion about religion. Morally insane. Being jealous of your husband's mistress. Insane, and one woman was locked up for this for 16 years. Scholars now estimate that a significant proportion of Victorian asylum patients exhibited no clear signs of mental illness whatsoever. They were committed for marital disputes, disobedience, or moral insanity. In plain language, they were committed for being inconvenient. Now let's go inside. The most famous asylum in England was Bethlem Hospital, known to everyone as Bedlam. The word itself became a synonym for chaos and madness. And there's a reason for that. Before reforms in the 1800s, Bedlam was less a hospital than a human zoo. Patients were kept in chains. They were beaten. They were starved. They slept naked on straw in freezing cells. And, this is the part that still makes me sick, they were put on display. For a penny, members of the public could walk through Bedlam and gawk at the inmates. They could watch people in the depths of mental anguish, screaming, crying, talking to themselves. It was entertainment. The hospital saw up to 96,000 visitors per year. 96,000 people paying to watch humans suffering like it was a show at the circus. And the treatments? They were based on the belief that mental illness lived in the body and could be purged out through physical punishment. Bloodletting, draining blood from the patient's veins. Purging, inducing vomiting and diarrhea until the patient was too weak to move. Blistering, burning the skin to create open wounds that would supposedly release the madness. Cold water immersion, strapping patients into chairs and dunking them into freezing ponds until they lost consciousness, then reviving them and doing it again. And perhaps the worst, rotation therapy. Patients were strapped into chairs suspended from the ceiling and spun, up to 100 rotations per minute, until they vomited uncontrollably. The idea was that the spinning would somehow reset their brains. All it actually did was cause permanent damage. Even as reforms were introduced in the Victorian era, physical restraint remained common. Straitjackets. Leather muffs that locked hands together. Restraint chairs that patients were strapped into for hours or days. Padded cells. Chains bolted to walls. One patient at Bethlem, a man named William Norris, was confined to his bed using a harness and chains for over 9 years. He couldn't sit up. He couldn't move. He just lay there, chained, for nearly a decade. When investigators finally documented his condition in 1814, the resulting scandal helped trigger reforms. But Norris himself died before he could benefit from them. And here's what's truly disturbing. Many patients weren't violent at all. They weren't dangerous. They were just sad. Or confused. Or unusual. One asylum record describes a patient committed for melancholia. Her supposed cause of insanity. Religious mania. That's crossed out in pencil. Replaced with one word, masturbation. That's what it took. One doctor's opinion, changed with a pencil stroke, could determine whether you spent the rest of your life in chains. The asylum system was devastating for everyone caught inside it. But it was designed, from the ground up, to control women. In Illinois in 1860, the law was explicit: a husband could commit his wife to an insane asylum, without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. Read that again. A husband didn't need to prove his wife was insane. He didn't need evidence. He didn't need a hearing. He just needed to request it. And once a woman was inside, she had no legal standing. No right to appeal. No way to prove her sanity because the very act of protesting was considered evidence of madness. If you said, "I'm not insane," that was denial, a symptom of insanity. If you demanded to be released, that was excitement, a symptom of insanity. If you wrote letters begging for help, they were intercepted because communication with the outside world might disturb your recovery. You couldn't win. The system was designed so that you couldn't win. Women were committed for rigorous intellectual study, being in bad company, novel reading, asking for a divorce, extreme jealousy. One woman's crime. She had a determination to use her mind, which doctors interpreted as eccentricity of conduct, meaning she was morally insane. These weren't aberrations. They were the standard practice of an entire medical establishment that genuinely believed women who thought for themselves were sick. And the husbands who put them there. They went home to their lives, free, while their wives rotted in asylums for years. Some women entered Victorian asylums as teenagers and died there as old women. They came in healthy. They came insane. And they were broken by the system itself. The isolation. The restraints. The treatments that caused permanent damage. The drugging, because by the 1880s, asylums had discovered sedatives. If a patient was too difficult, too loud, too demanding, they were simply drugged into silence. Patient after patient, record after record, tells the same story. Admitted for hysteria, or nervous excitement, or uterine disorders. Remained for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Discharged, never. Cause of death, general debility. Exhaustion. Chronic illness. They didn't die of mental illness. They died of captivity. In June 1860, a woman named Elizabeth Packard was kidnapped from her own home. Her crime? She disagreed with her husband about religion. Elizabeth was 43 years old, a mother of 6, a minister's wife. By all accounts she was intelligent, articulate, and completely sane. But she had committed the unforgivable sin of thinking for herself. She'd expressed interest in spiritualism. She'd discussed new religious ideas in her Bible study group. She defended abolition. And she'd dared to contradict her husband in public. So Theophilus Packard did what Victorian husbands could do, he had her committed. He didn't need proof. He didn't need a hearing. In Illinois, a husband could commit his wife by request. All he needed was a doctor's signature, and he got one from a doctor who came to their house pretending to be a sewing machine salesman. Elizabeth Packard spent 3 years in the Jacksonville Insane Asylum. But here's what makes her different. She didn't break. Inside the asylum, Elizabeth found other women like herself. Sane women. Intelligent women. Women whose husbands had simply decided they were too much trouble. One had been committed for extreme jealousy, and was midway through a 16-year sentence. Others were there for reading novels. For hard study. For being too opinionated. Elizabeth wrote. She documented. She smuggled letters out of the asylum by sewing them into the linings of clothes. When she was finally released, not because she was declared sane, but because she was declared incurable, and therefore not worth keeping, she went home to find that her husband had sold everything. Her furniture. Her savings. Her children had been taken to Massachusetts. She had no legal rights. No property. No custody of her own children. So she fought. Elizabeth Packard spent the next 30 years campaigning for reform. She wrote books. She gave speeches. She lobbied legislators. She won passage of laws in Illinois and Massachusetts giving wives the right to a trial before commitment. She won laws protecting asylum patients' right to send mail. She won reforms that required independent doctors to evaluate patients. And in 1869, she finally won custody of her children. When she died in 1897, she had helped pass 34 laws across multiple states, protecting the rights of women and asylum patients. All because one husband thought he could silence her. He couldn't. The Victorian asylum system wasn't primarily about treating mental illness. It was about control. Control of women who thought for themselves. Control of people who didn't conform. Control of anyone who made powerful people uncomfortable. The doctors genuinely believed they were helping. They genuinely believed that women who read too much or had opinions or enjoyed sex were sick. They built an entire medical framework around their prejudices and called it science. And thousands of people suffered for it. Locked away for years. Subjected to treatments that were torture by another name. Drugged into silence. Forgotten. We look back now and wonder, how could they not see? How could they believe that novel reading was a symptom of madness? But the question we should really be asking is, what are we doing right now that future generations will look back on in horror? What are we calling treatment that's actually control? What common sense beliefs do we hold that are just prejudice dressed up as medicine? The Victorians weren't uniquely cruel. They were human. They believed what their society told them to believe. And so do we. If this made you feel something, rage, disbelief, recognition, tell me in the comments. And if you're new here, Soot and Silk tells the stories of people who were silenced. The women who were locked away. The children who were forgotten. The inconvenient ones who history tried to erase. Subscribe if you want to remember them with me. Because someone should.